That's when I'll give a call. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, our Commander-in-Chief, Vice Admiral Ajendra Bahadur Singh, Param Visist Seva Medal, please sit down, Ati Visist Seva Medal, Visist Seva Medal, ADC, Flag Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Western Naval Command, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of President NFMC, it's my proud privilege to welcome you all for the 20th Soman Memorial Lecture today. The guest speaker is a veteran Vice Admiral Girish Luthra, Param Visist Seva Medal, Ati Visist Seva Medal, Visist Seva Medal, former Flag Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Western Naval Command. Before I introduce the guest speaker, it would be prudent to glance at the short presentation on late Admiral B.S. Soman, in whose memory we've been conducting the memorial lecture for the past 20 years. Vice Admiral Girish Luthra, retired, Param Visis Seva Medal, Ati Visis Seva Medal, Visis Seva Medal. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Girish Luthra started his schooling at Tagore Bal Niketan, Karnal, and studied the pre-university from DAV College, Chandigarh, before joining the NDA. He was commissioned into the Indian Navy in July 79, topped the service subjects in NDA, and was awarded the Telescope for being the best all-round cadet during the Sea Cadet phase on board INS Mysore. He also won the R.D. Katari Trophy for standing first overall in his MIDS board and sub-lieutenant courses. A navigation and direction specialist, he served extensively on various ships of Indian Navy. Besides Staff College at DSS Wellington, he attended the Naval High Command course at the Naval War College, USA, where he was also the class president. Some of the important staff appointments held by him include Deputy NA at High Commission of India in London, Fleet Navigating Officer, Command Plans Officer, Director Net Assessment, Principal Director Naval Plans, and ACNS PNP. He's commanded frontline warships, INS Kukri, the missile frigate Talwar, and the aircraft carrier Virat. During 2011 and 12, he was a flag officer commanding Western Fleet. On promotion to the rank of Vice Admiral in 2012, he took over as Director General Naval Operations, and thereafter he was appointed DCNS Ops Integrated Defense Staff, and in January 2016 took over as CNC Southern Naval Command. 6 months later, he took over as Commander-in-Chief of the Western Naval Command and superannuated on 31st Jan 2019 after 40 years of distinguished service. He has rich experience in strategy and perspective planning, net assessment, plans, operations, disaster management, finance, international affairs and foreign cooperation, cyberspace, training, and tri-services issues. He steered preparation of many official documents which include the Maritime Capability Perspective Plan 2027, Indian Maritime Doctrine, Defense Space Roadmap 2030, and Raksha Mantri's OP Directive. An eminent scholar in strategic and international affairs, he has published several research papers and articles. His papers have won numerous awards in India and abroad. He's spoken at various fora and conferences, including the Raisina Dialogue, India Economic Forum, National Defense College, staff colleges, universities, schools, educational institutes, and corporate events. He's also held the position of Chairman, Maritime History Society, Mumbai, Vice President, Yachting Association of India, and Trustee Chairman, Sea Cadet Corps, India. Post his superannuation, he's worked as Managing Director of a biotech company. He is currently advisor with a leading business house and a distinguished fellow at Observer Research Foundation, a leading multidisciplinary think tank of India. At ORF, he has published a number of research papers in the past 2 years, focusing mainly on Indo-Pacific and Russia-Ukraine conflict. He is married to Mrs. Preeti, a homemaker, who has been President Nava Western Region, and she has been associated with community-related activities for many, many years. She is currently a voluntary teacher with an NGO, Angel Express, which imparts education to underprivileged children in Mumbai. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished speaker for today, Vice Admiral Girish Luthra, Param Visis Seva Medal, Ati Visis Seva Medal, Visis Seva Medal, a former Commander-in-Chief of Sword Arm of Indian Navy. Welcome, sir. Please, big round of applause for Admiral Luthra for the talk today. Thank you. Welcome, sir. Thank you. Jain, sir.
Next slide. Commander-in-Chief, flag officers, commanding officers, serving personnel, President, Navy Foundation, Mumbai chapter, veterans, Veer Naris, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first thank the Navy Foundation, Mumbai, and Western Naval Command for the invitation to speak at this Soman Memorial Lecture. I also would like to appreciate an early morning start by some of our veterans from distant places who have come all the way before we move into the veterans' lunch. I'm going to be talking about the Indo-Pacific and the new intersectionality of geopolitics and geoeconomics that we are facing today. Now, geopolitics and geoeconomics, the history of these two, is interrelated or interlinked with the history of sea power. For a long time, many of the maritime thinkers, from Thucydides to Mahan to Corbett, Panikkar, and many others, highlighted the importance of peace and prosperity, power and prosperity, essentially highlighting geopolitics and geoeconomics. And both geopolitics and geoeconomics, which were earlier sort of localized in the earlier wars, became more globalized through the oceans. A number of our naval concepts are, in addition to war fighting, are linked with trade and commerce. Now, I'm highlighting these aspects because this audience, a naval audience, is quite familiar with the intersectionality of geopolitics and geoeconomics. So we all know that yes, these two are linked, but what I'm going to be doing today is highlighting the paradigm in which this intersectionality is operating in the current times. And I will relate this to the Indo-Pacific region where this intersectionality is really being played out. The Indo-Pacific region, the confluence of two oceans. Earlier in 2007, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had talked about confluence of two seas, essentially talking about these two oceans. Indian Ocean, which is the oldest ocean, and Pacific Ocean, which is the youngest, where the voyages started only around the 16th century AD. These two oceans together as a strategic space. Now, the map that you see on the screen behind me is only for the purpose of illustration. This is not the conceptualization of each and every country which is sort of participating in the Indo-Pacific framework. There are different conceptualization of geographical expanse of the Indo-Pacific. But without getting into those details, this is, as I said, more for illustration, and it aligns more with the Indian conceptualization of what the Indo-Pacific region is. And this region gained prominence, gained salience over a period of time because of the economic activity that shifted to this area in the past few years. At present, 60% of the world's GDP, 66% of GDP growth, and 70% of world trade are taking place in this region. In 2016, when we and many other people were talking about the Indo-Pacific, there was a debate whether it is a coherent strategic space. But that debate is behind us because today it is recognized as a space, because earlier there were doubts that the two oceans with so many dissimilarities, different sub-regions having their own peculiarities, but that is behind us. But another thing that has happened is that in the beginning, the focus was exclusively on the maritime domain. We were talking about freedom of navigation and things like that. Today, it has moved to a much broader agenda. And anybody who's looking at the Indo-Pacific and comes up with a strategy for the Indo-Pacific is essentially talking about a global strategy. We have also seen in this period a number of partnerships come up, whether it is the Quad partnership or the AUKUS or the Russia-China no limits partnership. But this is the area which is the area of this convergence of geopolitics and geoeconomics, which we will be discussing as we go forward. Major things that happened in the last 10 to 15 years was the operationalization of the US pivot to Asia, which was later retermed as rebalance to Asia, and the rise, assertiveness, and aggressiveness of China, which has been evident for last 15 to 20 years, but became more pronounced after the arrival of the current president, President Xi Jinping. Several countries, groupings, since 2017 have announced their Indo-Pacific strategies or outlooks or their approach. And this list is growing. Just about 2 months ago, we had Canada joining or announcing its Indo-Pacific strategy, laying out its Indo-Pacific strategy, Indian Ocean Rim Association, and just about 2 weeks ago, South Korea has also joined. So the list is growing. In the last 4 or 5 years, as you can see, the list of countries which have come up with their strategies for this region is growing. But this is not to suggest that they are all looking at the Indo-Pacific in the same way. There are many divergences. Some very direct, some quite subtle. But there is one common theme in all these strategies and approaches, that China looms large in most of these strategies. Talking about China, which has now acquired a new strategic identity in the last 15 to 20 years, it made a decisive move towards a maritime orientation. But once again, this is not to suggest that China gave up its continental orientation. It achieved a new form of hybridization of continental and maritime orientation, but increasingly focusing on the maritime domain. Targets have been clearly defined to have a world-class military by 2035 and to win wars against a big power like the USA by 2049. Both China and Russia are opposed to the concept of Indo-Pacific because they feel it is a relic of the Cold War and it is something like bloc politics. China in the defense and security segment has undertaken numerous initiatives, numerous reforms, which most of us are familiar with, and these have shown results across the board. China has also been indulging in what has been termed as gray zone operations, that is between peace and hostilities. I want to talk a little bit about the Belt and Road Initiative, which was earlier called OBOR, that is One Belt, One Road. This grand vision that was outlined in 2013 is a good example of this convergence of geopolitics and geoeconomics, because it has elements of both. And it has a continental orientation and a maritime orientation as well. Now, these are the objectives of the Belt and Road Initiative. These have not been spelled out anywhere, neither by China or anybody else. I have just summarized these because that is what these appear to be. Last 3 or 4 years, Belt and Road Initiative has slowed down a bit for a number of reasons, and these include COVID-19, a pushback by many countries, domestic challenges being faced by China, and questions being raised about BRI's transparency, debt trap, quality, sovereignty. All these issues came up regarding Belt and Road Initiative. And there has been a pushback and there has been a slowing down of the BRI. But we must keep in mind that the BRI has already done a lot in different sectors. Let us take the port sector, for example. Today, China has a control or investment in a port on every continent of the world. If you take Africa, then on both coasts of Africa, about 61 ports are either under Chinese management or under Chinese control, or China has investment, or a combination of these. Now, in addition to security and economic related issues, we must keep in mind that this provides China with very good data and information on trade and commerce flows. Now, what are the drivers of this new intersectionality that I'm highlighting today between geopolitics and geoeconomics? The first and foremost is globalization and protectionism. There has been a lot of debate whether globalization is dead, but I think globalization is very much alive and around. Only thing is, it has changed in form. It is taking place in a very different way than it was 15 to 20 years ago. Maybe the other realms of globalization were not given adequate attention around the world, and the attention was focused primarily on economic globalization. And the other layers of globalization led to a negative perception about globalization, which in turn led to protectionism and nationalism in part. And today, we are seeing globalization coming in direct conflict with protectionism, and that is one of the major drivers of this intersectionality. There is a new conceptualization of the world order by different states, big powers, middle powers, small powers. Everybody is looking at the new world order in a different way. There is all-domain strategic competition which is unfolding. And in this competition, it is interesting to see, I think the best example is how the EU, the European Union, terms China in its strategy. It calls China a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival, all three together. Now, today, we are facing this kind of competition where you are cooperating as well as competing. And then all this is taking place under the overarching umbrella of technology. Some of the breakthrough emerging critical technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, Internet of Things, quantum computing, cloud computing, 5G, biotechnology, and you can add to that, the hydrogen, green hydrogen technologies. Some people have called that currently technologies are broadly operating in three domains. That is compute tech, all computing technologies, biotech, and clean tech, all technologies related to clean energy or for sustainable development. There is a rapid increase in digitalization in the last 5 to 10 years. Similarly, there is a big increase in use of data, use and exploitation, sometimes misuse of data as well. Data science, data analytics, data management, cross-border data flows, data regulation, there are different fields under data. But data and digital progress are leading to, again, this strong intersectionality between geopolitics and geoeconomics, because data and digital are not just domestic, are not just national. There is a focus on diversification. COVID-19 Taiwan crisis, Russia-Ukraine war, all have shown the importance of diversification of supply chains, global supply chains, and global value chains. Climate and biodiversity action, which is now a big sort of agenda item on the global stage, also implicates trade, commerce, finance, and security across the spectrum from human security to hard security. So, what is in play? What are we witnessing because of this intersectionality? We are witnessing, firstly, weaponization of everything. Everything is weaponized today. It wasn't the case earlier. Today, for example, media outlets across the world are being weaponized. Films, entertainment, sports, mobile apps. In every sphere, we see weaponization. Trade, technology, and sanctions are three other very important areas in play. I'm planning to speak on each of these issues separately as we go forward. And then there is this competition for connectivity. I talked about BRI, but today there is competition for connectivity in physical domain, connectivity in digital domain, and connectivity in human domain, that is in people-to-people domain. In all these domains, there is a competition for connectivity that is in progress. Violent conflicts are taking place around us because of this intersectionality. And of course, as I mentioned, grain zone operations are taking place. There has been an expansion of insecurities because of this intersectionalities. Defense expenditures have risen and are rising very rapidly around the world. Even countries with pacifist leanings like Japan and Germany, who for 75 years stayed away from high defense expenditure after the Second World War, have revisited their strategies and now are pursuing a more proactive agenda in the defense and security space, going above, for the first time, 2% of their GDP for defense expenditure. Let me talk a little bit about trade. Now, trade was the first economic activity to rebound after COVID-19. In 2021, after COVID-19, the total global trade was $28.5 trillion, which was 13 to 14% increase since the pre-pandemic levels. But despite this increase, what has happened is that there are very strong tensions and undercurrents in the global trading system. A system of trade interdependence, which was in the past considered a very good thing in the global trading system, is now the very reason for growth of insecurities. There are insecurities related to trade interdependence. There are unilateral approaches, coercive approaches as far as trade is concerned. We have seen in the context of China, Australia, China with many other countries, in some cases the US as well. There are also increasingly regular instances of use of security exceptions which are permitted under the GATT, under WTO, for national purpose, quoting a security reason for imposing some sort of trade restrictions. Trade is also getting fragmented. the global supply chains and value chains reorientation that I talked about earlier. Today, there is reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring which is in progress. Reshoring means bringing the economic activity, or including manufacturing activity, into your own country. So therefore, you have make in China, made in India, make in India. You have the US concepts and legislation which are bringing many of these activities back to their own countries. And therefore, there is a trade fragmentation which is now looking at globalization in a very gated manner, where the trade is being aligned geopolitically. It is not a free flow of trade around the world. It is trade compartmentalization or trade fragmentation which is geopolitically aligned. Let me talk a little bit about technology, which is also having an overarching influence. There is a fierce competition for dominance in the leading technologies, in the critical technologies, both for economic as well as for military purposes. In some areas, we have seen decoupling, and in some areas, we are seeing partnerships. Both are happening together. There is decoupling and containment through technology, which is going on. At the same time, there are technology partnerships. Under Quad, there are technology partnerships, there are alliances, there is a Chip 4 alliance, etc., which are taking place. Now here, while we have a number of technologies that I mentioned earlier, let me use the example of semiconductors and chips as political and economic weapons. Chips today are most critical, and they impact all sectors, including defense sector. In defense, a missile like a anti-tank missile Javelin uses more than 250 chips. Manufacturing of chips is broadly in East Asia. More than 70% of all chips are manufactured in East Asia, and more than 93% of high-end chips, that is 5 nanometer and below, are manufactured in Taiwan and South Korea. China for some time has been trying to grow in the space, semiconductor and chip space. Today, by the way, as is mentioned here, China's chips imports are bigger than China's oil imports. So China's growth or intention to grow in this sector is something that was worrisome for the United States in the US-China competition. And the US in 2022, in August last year, came up with the Chips and Science Act, which is to be seen along with the Inflation Reduction Act that the US came up with. What this act tries to do is first to bring chip manufacturing, advanced chips manufacturing into the United States. It also offers subsidies. Overall, the act is a package of about $52 billion, out of which about $39 billion are for subsidies for the US companies. US citizens are not allowed any longer to work for any Chinese chip company. You are not allowed to transfer any technology or design to Chinese company, and you are not allowed to supply any assembling or manufacturing equipment to Chinese companies for manufacture of chips. And this is being done in coordination with a number of US allies and partners. This is, other than making a big radical change in the American industrial policy. In many ways, it's a big change from the earlier industrial policy for bringing jobs and bringing manufacturing back into the US. But it is also to stunt the growth of this critical sector in China. At present, 9 out of 10 rapidly or most fastest growing chip companies are in China. And China, otherwise, without such an action, would catch up very quickly and then become once again a key player in the chip market. Now, I'm using the chips example only as an illustration. Similar things are happening in other critical and important technologies. Let me move on to talk a bit about economic sanctions, which is another major area where this intersectionality is playing out. Sanctions have also existed for time immemorial. But the concept of modern sanctions can be related to the end of the First World War, when these were included under Article 16 of the Covenant of League of Nations. It was termed the economic weapon. It was influenced at that time by the embargoes and blockades, mostly naval embargoes and blockades, which were found to be successful and were being considered as an antidote to war itself. So it got included in the League of Nations, and later it was retained under Article 41 of the United Nations Charter. During the Cold War, the usage was there, but not so much. But it is since the end of the Cold War that the usage of economic sanctions as a political instrument has increased many fold. I'm going to be using the example of Russia-Ukraine conflict, where sanctions are in play now. And today, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. There are sanctions applied around the world, but Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. Now, in the case of Russia-Ukraine conflict, the sanctions started in 2014. They are not new, not in this year, not in 2022, but in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and Sevastopol. So the first phase of sanctions came in soon thereafter, but the sanctions at that time were limited in some sense, and they kept in mind the impact on the sender countries, that is the countries that is primarily the EU and the US, to limit the impact. At the same time, their imports, exports, and trade, particularly in energy sector, continued. These were focused more on investments, finance, and some specific individuals, entities, and sectors. The impact was very limited in political sense, because for 8 years these sanctions remained in place. They did not deter a war, they could only delay it. The war finally happened in 2022 February, which is going on at present. And it did not change the political outlook of Russia as a tool. Although it is important to keep in mind that sanctions should not be seen for success or failure as an independent instrument, because it is in play with many other instruments. Come February 2022, or in fact January 2022, when it was becoming clear that Russia-Ukraine war was becoming more and more likely, the West, the US, specifically indicated to Russia that if Russia invades Ukraine, sanctions will be sharp, they will be swift, they will be coordinated, and they will start at the top of the escalation ladder and will stay there. But this threat of sanctions also did not deter Russia, and 24th of February, the war started. During this war, now we are 10 months are over of this war, 10 and a half months are over of this war. Politically, once again, it could not lead to any ceasefire so far. It could not lead to a change in the Russian outlook. Economically, the first phase of sanctions, there are different estimates as to what was the impact in those 8 years, but the impact was limited, 0.2 to 0.4% of GDP on Russia. In the second phase, again, estimates have been varying. Every 3 months, the new estimates come up from IMF and other agencies, and they have been lowered. Russia has withstood the economic, the sanctions from the economic impact point of view because of strong resilience in exports, primarily in energy sector, and diversification of exports. But it is the imports that have been hurting Russia, which in due course will also impact the outcome of the war. Here, what I want to highlight for this audience, particularly the surveying audience, is that this is a new model of war. You cannot simply take a view of destroying enemies' war-waging potential. We have seen what happens if you set out with that objective. Because in this new model, we are seeing 3 things in operation in tandem. And these 3 things are the military operations, which are in progress, economic sanctions, which are as big, if not bigger, than the military operations. And the third is the military aid and the economic aid which is pouring in. So it is aid, sanctions, and military operations, all 3 working together as a new model of war, which requires other countries to prepare so that they are resilient tomorrow if they have to face any sanctions. But at the same time, military planners need to take into account some of these economic factors as well. So, this new intersectionality, what are the implications of this heightened intersectionality of geopolitics and geoeconomics? We are at a crossroad, and we can say we are at an inflection point, and this decade, the ongoing decade, is going to be very defining and is going to bring about fundamental shifts in the global and the regional order. Economic globalization, peaceful economic globalization, is unlikely to return. It is going to be a tense globalization that is going to be in play. We are going to see more uncertainty, more instability, and therefore possibilities of more conflict. Middle powers will play an increasingly important role. But at the same time, I must add that it is too early to signal the arrival of multipolarity. If there is some accommodation in this strategic competition and this heightened intersectionality, maybe there are 2 ways that some sort of strategic stability can be achieved. One, either through informed accommodation or through countervailing influence by middle powers. So we will wait and see how that plays out in the next 8 to 10 years. But I think the last world order came into being at the end of a war, after a military victory in the Second World War. The next world order, which will come about in the next few years, will be based on this heightened intersectionality of geopolitics and geoeconomics. Thank you.
Now the question answer session. We have two mic men. Please raise your hand. Any questions? But before you ask your question, please introduce yourself.
So, good morning, sir. I am Commander Kunjal Mehta, serving in headquarters, sir. Sir, thank you, sir, for the very enlightening lecture, sir. Sir, my question is on the present war, sir, between Russia and Ukraine. Now, sir, in your lecture, sir, you had briefed that finally it is the geo-economics between the two countries which operate. NATO is like around 50 trillion USD economies. All the economies are worth around $50 trillion, while Russia is less than $1 trillion, $900 billion and shrinking. So my question is, isn't it David and Goliath happening with Russia being pushed more towards China? Sir, what are your views on this? Thank you, sir.
Yes, Russia is not as big an economy as NATO countries put together, or for that matter, China, which is at about $18.5 trillion now. So there have been concerns that if such sanctions in the future were to be applied against China, if this is and this time the impact has not just been on the recipient countries and the sender countries. We have seen that there has been an impact on the global south as a whole. The developing world has also been impacted, whether it is inflation, whether it is rising prices, whether it is foreign exchange reserves, the turmoil in currency markets. So the global south has also been impacted significantly. But at the same time, it was important to note that Russia is a major economy. And earlier sanctions were applied to smaller countries which were not really a big, this was a G20 economy. And at one stage, Russia was to be, G7 was to become G8 in 2014, and G8 never happened because Crimea happened. So, yes, bigger the economy, more the impact. But necessarily, Russia, as I mentioned, has for 8 years has been preparing for this kind of sanctions. Now, you talked about whether this will bring Russia closer to China. There was anticipation that after this war, there will be more support from China to Russian military operations. That has not happened. China has taken a very pragmatic view, although just before the war, 3 weeks before the war, what I talked about as their no limits partnership, which was announced in the first week of February. And the war took place on the 24th of February. And they have now started doing a number of exercises, particularly in the Eastern Indo-Pacific region, and are sort of putting up a joint front against the US groupings or coalitions that are working in the Eastern Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, East China Sea area. But China has been pragmatic and has not gone forward in supporting Russia as much as was anticipated. This is also perhaps to open a window for dialogue, to continue its dialogue with the West and recover the slowness that China has been facing till now. So probably this relationship will grow in future with China being a bigger or a dominant partner.
Thank you, sir. Next question.
Morning, sir. Captain S.C. Divakar, retired. First, many thanks for enlightening us on the new model of war. This is something which we never thought of. Now, this is something which has not been discussed in media. Second is one aspect which really baffles many of us. That is, China was allowed to play freely In South China Sea, like they started with the rejection of the ICJ, on freedom of navigation. Then they started this thing. So, what could be the reason that China was allowed to play like this, and now every country is trying to contain China? So that is one thing. Second, my this thing is, what is India's approach in the Indo-Pacific region? Is it a pragmatic approach, or we are going 2 steps forward and coming back 1 step backwards? Thank you.
Two parts of your question. The first part deals with how China got a free run in the Eastern Indo-Pacific, particularly South China Sea and the East China Sea. It was not a sort of a free run allowed. It was the Chinese approach in that area. And China has its own sort of explanation for what it is doing in that region. But of course, now it is well known that China's inclusion in the WTO and the misreading of the partnership by the West, particularly the US, about the partnership, that in due course, through this partnership, China will be brought back into a more sort of democratic kind of way of doing things, which did not happen, and that China will abide by the rules-based order, which of course, quote unquote, is the rules post the Second World War, defined primarily by the West. So China did not come around on that, and China actually started moving away into a different approach to assert itself. So it was not a free sort of run that was given by anybody, but the consequences of Chinese actions were realized, and that is how the approaches of many countries started to come together. Now, the second part that you talk about is India's approach to the Indo-Pacific. Now, as you can see from Quad, and India's come up with its own, security and growth for all in the region, IPOI, Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which has got 7 pillars. Maritime security is one pillar. India highlighted its outlook at East Asia Summit when Prime Minister Modi gave India's approach to the Indo-Pacific. India has been reluctant to join any military alliance, and that is why that is one area where India sort of differed with some of the partners, and that is why India is member of the Quad, but not a member of a grouping like the AUKUS, which is more of a military alliance, Australia, UK, and US. So India's approach has been more to have a development-linked cooperative security. That is what India's approach, I would term in one sentence. India is seeking to try and bring in development-linked cooperative. Many of the Indo-Pacific countries who have come up with these strategies also do not share a land border with China, which India does. So India has other concerns to look at. And India today is also trying to bring an alternate viewpoint by becoming the voice of the global South. Now, with G20 leadership with India during this year, India is also trying to see that India can champion without moving back to the non-aligned era, but at the same time championing and promoting the cause of the developing world.
So, Commander Johnson, thanks. I think it's already been mentioned, but I've been privileged to a continuing conversation in a university setting. And so my question is, from this canvas of intersectionality that you painted, how does this impact our approach to professional military education in India, particularly for the Navy? And an associated part is, what can the veteran community contribute towards that? Because this is something, though there is some continuity from our learnings of history and strategy, but this is something that requires much deeper dive. So what are some of the changes we'll need to?
Wonderful, wonderful, Commodore Odukal, sir. Very good question.
Yeah, thank you. Good question, as mentioned. Now, from professional military education point of view, the broader theme, we need to bring in the economic element much more into our conversations and our assessments and our appreciations and everything else. That element, it cannot be today purely military assessment as we normally do in, let's say, commander's estimate of situation and things like that. And not just related to a situation that is CES process or the appreciation process, but also in our other areas of operations, about foreign cooperation, the economic element has to be brought into professional military education in a bigger way than what is being done now. Economic, I mean geoeconomic, and not pure economics. And we are not here to have military officers becoming economists. That is certainly not the intention. But today, economists or students of economics recognize the importance of understanding geopolitics, which was not the case in the past. In their education structure, in the leading schools of economics globally and now in India as well, geopolitics has been introduced. And so vice versa, geoeconomics should be introduced into professional military education. And how can the veteran community help? Well, the veteran community can help by helping, you mean helping the Navy? I do not think the Navy will require that much. Once the Navy sort of structures that this is the direction to take for bringing in geoeconomics into the PME, professional medical education, I'm sure they will be able to handle it themselves, the serving community, without really too much of help needed from the veteran community. But the veteran community, in many ways, can be the interface on that account between the Navy and the civil population as a whole.
Good afternoon, Commander Kalawat here, sir. My question is, seeing the history of Americans ditching their friends at certain time, our friendship with Russia and our borders with China, what should be the ideal foreign policy for India?
That's a question. I think, firstly, it's a question that will take a long time to answer for anybody.
It's
and
debatable.
Also, it is perhaps not my sort of area where I could say what India's foreign policy ought to be going forward. But you have seen the reorientation in the Indian policy, particularly after the Russia-Ukraine war, and India playing a more sort of independent role, and India having an increasingly important voice in regional and global affairs. But there is a long way to go, because you can have a voice in international affairs and you can orient foreign policy, but at the end of the day, you need all elements of national power to come together. We have a lot of catching up to do. In 1990, China was 4% of global GDP as a share. Today, it is at about 15–16% of global GDP. We talk about, and this is a personal view, we talk about $5 trillion economy, $7 trillion economy, $10 trillion economy. My personal view is that yes, that is fine, but what we need to be talking about is our share in the global economy. Not 5 trillion or 7 trillion or 10 trillion. By when will we reach India will have a 10% share in the global economy, and by when are we going to have 15% share in economy, and maybe in future years 20% of global economy. That is the target that we should define, and that is the target that we should set. And unless those targets and all elements of national power come together, many of the other initiatives that India wants to take, it may not be that effective. So those have to move in parallel. But yes, as I said, the broader question is for more, people who are more sort of aligned or more knowledgeable on foreign policy matters. Maybe they should be answering that question.
Well said, sir. Next.
Good afternoon, sir. This is Major Jadhav. I specifically you mentioned about grey zone operations. I'd like if you could elucidate something which has been a successful grey zone or an unsuccessful grey zone, or maybe both, and how it has impacted on a specific geopolitical or a geo-economic issue.
So you see, much is being written and talked about on grey zone operations, as I mentioned, which operate between peace and hostilities. And for grey zone operations, you need not use only the elements of military. Some are not so openly out as elements of military. You have the fishing fleet, you have the research vessels, you have the merchant ships, which are also used, or which are primarily used for grey zone operations, for gathering intelligence, for even cases of ramming that have been reported, which are deploying to far and extended areas, not just in coastal areas. And so they sort of link with the naval operations. China has made it mandatory for merchant ships to meet certain specifications. All merchant ships must meet certain specifications to be utilized for sort of military role. China also came up with the Coast Guard Act, the Coast Guard law that was promulgated about 3 years ago, which gave again new and sweeping powers to the Chinese Coast Guard. So the grey zone operations have a major role to play. Now, success or failure of these operations, you see that there is no clear determination of success or failure, but they constitute another element that has to be taken into account.
Thank you, sir. Next question.
So, as you rightly mentioned, something about intersectionality, sir. So, in the present era, India's stature at the global level is continuously rising. So, sir, the projects like the BBIN, Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal connectivity project, or the tri-junction project between India, Bangladesh and Myanmar, and many other connectivity projects that we have started. So, what are the concerns for India in the present and in the future, looking at the level of the free trade agreements that India is signing with the major economies? So how should we tackle such threats, sir?
Okay, a number of points actually rolled into your question. You brought in free trade agreements, you brought in infrastructure projects, India's infrastructure projects, now where India is helping out setting up of those infrastructure projects. India has had some success in infrastructure projects in its neighborhood, in Africa. But once again, you see, by 2021, estimates are that China had spent something like $750 billion on BRI projects. Now, for BRI, China created different funds. There is, other than the different banks, China Exim Bank, China Development Bank, which finance BRI activities, there was a separate fund that was created, which is called the Silk and Road Fund. So funding or the finance for these projects is a major requirement, for which what India has been doing is tying up with Japan, EU, other friendly countries to do some of the, and that is why there are a number of several initiatives where some Western countries, India, and some Southeast Asian countries have joined together for such projects. And the list of these projects is now very long. And list of these associations is also very long. And that is what I mentioned, that there is a competition for connectivity now, which is on. But India's limitations are also related to financing of such projects. You talked about the free trade areas. India has started free trade areas now, after having been reluctant for a long time to be part of any FTAs. And now we've signed one with UAE, the CEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and very recently with Australia about 3-4 weeks back, which is now actually on 30th or 31st of December, it has come into execution, which should open up the markets, reduce subsidies on more than 80-90% of items for both sides. There are benefits on both sides. So India is moving in that direction now. It's again a larger question of seeing your domestic industry, your domestic manufacturing, your domestic capabilities in their readiness to take on the sort of competition. That is one concern. India did not join the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive and Economic Partnership, which is 10 plus 5, 10 ASEAN countries and 5 other countries, which came into implementation in 2022, which is in force now. India refused to join RCEP because of concerns related to our agriculture sector and some other sectors that we will perhaps get dumped with Chinese goods and Chinese expertise. So sector by sector, one-on-one, India has now started, instead of going into a multilateral FTAs, India is going into more bilateral FTAs, which India currently feels are more beneficial, where sector by sector discussions and negotiations can take place, and some of the areas or some of the sectors that India wants to take care of are not adversely impacted.
Okay, we had enough questions. We'll have last question now.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Commander Korti. You made a prediction that the new world order will emerge out of the intersectionality of the geopolitics and geoeconomics. With the India aspiring to be that whatever, the 5 trillion, 7 trillion, 10 trillion and all that, that by 25 we want to be 5 trillion economy, 10 trillion by 2030, and by, the centenary of the independence, we want to be the, one of the developed countries. I look at this 5 trillion, 10 trillion as more as a, targets, and that as a consequence that, 5%, 10% of the world trade will, that India will emerge. So, and with the Atmanirbharata and, that military complex getting the push and exports, all that kind of a thing. Not only the government is, aspiring to take India forward, the young generation, there is an aspiration in the Indians. So would you like to do some crystal gazing? Okay, what will be the position of India in this new world order that you foresee, say by about 2030, if not by 2047? Thank you, sir.
Good question, good question.
I think there is a global recognition of India's role and importance in all areas, and this importance and role is only going to increase. You rightly mentioned an aspirational India. Some of the sectors that I mentioned in the talk today about digital, about data, where India is already setting an example for the world, digital particularly. The UPI system that India rolled out, which becomes the base for other payment systems, other digital measures that India has taken, and the digital connectivity that India has achieved, that is become an example for the rest of the world. With limited resources in diverse areas, India has made progress and shown to the world how it can be done. Some of those are, as I mentioned, some of those are being showcased in the G20 deliberations. But for example, in technologies, the key technologies that I talked about, we still have a lot of work to do. I gave an example of chips, for example, semiconductors and chips. Now, semiconductors and chips has a big ecosystem. There is chip design, which to a large extent is with the US. There is the raw materials. There is the silicon wafers, etc., items that come from different parts. Then there are manufacturing and assembling equipment, which is supplied by Netherlands, US, Japan. Then there is manufacturing, and after manufacturing is ATP, that is assembly, testing, and packaging. Now, all these actually make the ecosystem of chips. Now, I'm once again referring to chips. India has made a beginning. As you know, India is now also setting up a chip manufacturing facility in Gujarat, where Vedanta and Foxconn are setting up that facility. Indian government has also announced $10 billion of assistance for semiconductor for chips. So, but we are making our beginnings in these areas. The government of India has also announced something whose success in the economic side has been already recognized, is the PLI scheme, the production-linked production-linked incentive schemes. In some crucial sectors, the PLI scheme has been announced, and chips is one of them, for example. So the PLI is that the more you produce, more incentives the government will give to you. It's linked with production. The success of PLI scheme is already showing in mobile phones, for example. Every year, in the last 3 years, India's mobile exports have increased. But in technology innovation, we are moving in the direction, and we have aspirational India, as you mentioned, and we have very bright minds in India. We have made a beginning, but we have some distance to go. Hopefully that distance will be covered in shorter period of time than in a longer period of time. And so we see India playing a much bigger role, but as I mentioned, whether India will achieve that fast enough to be a pole by itself, that remains to be seen. It's too early to tell that.
Thank you very much, sir. Due to time constraint, we won't be able to take further questions. But ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, it was fantastic talk by Admiral Luthra, and he's covered it so well. Not only the talk, the bounces thrown by the audience, he's batted very well. Big round of applause for Admiral Luthra.
Thank you.
May I now request our CNC, Commander Vadera, Mrs. Preeti Luthra, Mrs. Sunita Vadera, Dr. Seema Sant, and Mrs. Jaya Devi Anand to come on stage for presentation. May I request Commander Vadera, President, Navy Foundation Mumbai chapter, to present a memento to our guest speaker, Admiral Girish Luthra. May now request Mrs. Sunita Vadera to present to Mrs. Preeti Luthra a book on health secrets to light 100 candles by our very own senior veteran, Commander Ashok Shinde. Commander Shinde is amongst us. May I request President NFMC to present a memento to Dr. Seema Sant, Associate Dean, Human Resource Management, Vesim Business School, who has guided our Mrs. Jayadevi Anand, wife of Commander Vivek Anand, from WNC in writing a paper on veterans' career transition, nation building resource. Okay. Next is a memento from Dr. Seema Sant to the NFMC. Thank you. May I request our Commander-in-Chief to present a memento to the guest speaker, Admiral Girish Luthra. Incidentally, they were in headquarters together, Commander-in-Chief and Chief of Staff. May I request our Commander-in-Chief to present a memento to President NFMC. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, now is the time for Admiral Ajendra Bahadur Singh to address the veterans and Veer Naris.
Admiral Shekhawat, former Chief of the Naval Staff, Admiral Girish Luthra, Admiral Inda Bedi, former CNCs, Admiral Rajaram Swaminathan, the DGNP, Admiral Krishna Swaminathan, our Chief of Staff, flag officers, senior veterans, functionaries and President of Navy Foundation Mumbai chapter, respected veterans, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon to all of you. I'm indeed glad that I'm here. And before I tell you what the Navy is doing, I'm indeed delighted to, in fact, add on some knickknacks to the lecture that has just gone by. It is not my intention to give another lecture of that long, but certainly just to tell you something about Admiral Soman. He became an acting captain in 1947 and became the Chief of the Naval Staff in 1962. 15 years from captain to the CNS. That's some achievement. And that's how the Navy should be. Second thing which I want to tell you is, I was born when he was the chief. So that's the distance that we've covered. So that's a lot of time. Third, if I'm not wrong, Admiral Shekhawat used to be his flag lieutenant. If the data that is available with me is correct. And last point which I want to make to you is the system of rotation of the chairman COSC was independent of the rank. And this is one thing which I think the serving Navy doesn't know, and many of their veterans may not know, that irrespective of the rank, whether you're a vice admiral or a full general or an air marshal, you would become the chairman's USC. Despite being junior in rank, you are still equivalent in terms of protocol. So Admiral Soman, Vice Admiral Soman was the chairman's USC, while the Army had a general as a chief of the Army staff, the Navy had a vice admiral, and yet he was chairman's USC. And there's something very nicely documented in a book on higher defense organization, which I had chanced upon at some point in time. I also want to say that while geoeconomics and geopolitics is shaping the world environment, I think we have to keep telling the world, and especially this naval fraternity here, who are the veterans, navies and sea power is about wealth creation. And that's where the whole thing flows from. So if you go back into history, whether it is the colonial era or the era before that, or the 1300s and the era, and I think this has been very aptly articulated by Admiral Sato of the Imperial Defense College, who describes the difference between a continental mindset and a maritime mindset. And the key points that he brings out is the continental mindset is about wealth destruction. So if you can take somebody's land, you're destroying his wealth. But before he'll give you that land, he'll burn it down. If you want to cross a bridge, in all probability, if he can't hold that bridge, he'll destroy that bridge. Whereas navies and sea power is about wealth creation, and that's how the colonization happened and everything happened. So if we just go back into history, I think it's a great thought, which I tend to follow. The second thing, there's a very nice question by Oracle Johnson as to what the veterans can do for professional military education. I tend to disagree with my former commander-in-chief that the veterans can't do anything. I think you can do a lot. And there's a very unique model which I had the experience of. The veterans got together, and they are specialists in their fields, got together and made a small company. And in this case, the company could be the Navy Foundation. And then you offer electives to officers who want to do it. And if you offer electives, I'm sure the Chief of Staff here and the CSO PNA will find a way to fund that elective for the serving community. It will not only benefit the Navy Foundation, but also benefit the serving community as well. So there is some scope in that. As far as the wide-ranging talk is concerned by Admiral Luthra, I would like to thank him and place on record our sincere thanks from the WNC. I'm sure the vote of thanks will cover that later on. But thank you, sir, for all the information and the knowledge that you imparted to all of us, especially the serving lot. Especially, I must say, about the PLI scheme. We had Commodore Paul Raj here in Mumbai a few months ago, and I had the good fortune to have a chat with him. And I asked him, sir, what are you doing here? And he said, I'm here to tell Mr. Chandrasekhar of Tata Sons, don't deter, just set up a plant. And, it hasn't happened till now, but I suppose he was trying to say, it's a good idea, why don't you go ahead and set up a plant for chip manufacturing. It may incur you losses in the beginning, but finally, it will be a great boon for the country. So thank you so much, sir, for your talk, and of course, all the inputs that you gave us. So there's no big shake about telling that the Navy Foundation Mumbai chapter is the largest community of veterans that are there. And I'm glad many of you are here despite the early morning start. But I thought I'll also use the opportunity to talk and tell you what all is happening in the WNC, and also kind of tell you what are we trying to do for the veterans as well. And before that, I do all that, I must extend a very warm greetings of the new year. May 2023 bring a lot of good health, happiness, and each one of you remain safe. We are thankful to each one of you for your contribution to the community, and the Navy that we are inherited or we are having today is courtesy a lot of efforts by each one of you here, some of you at the very highest levels. And I keep telling you that anything that we can do, we recognize our responsibilities in WNC, and we are willing to walk that extra mile if there is any requirement. I must also compliment the NFMC, which has done a wonderful job. It's full of josh, and I think the president, I'll have to ask him कि किस चक्की का वो आटा खाते हैं, really speaking, because I think that's an important facet. We were also told that the amount of work that he does, in any case, we are meeting tomorrow for the flag off of the Veterans Day parade, and he's got the governor on board, and he's going to be there. So a lot of work is being done, and I must compliment Commander Vadera for his energy, for the effort that he puts in everything that he does. And the most important thing that I have learned actually is that they had a wonderful trip to South Africa, and I think these are some of the life goals that some of us also have post-retirements. So thank you so much, Commander Vadera, for all that you've done as the president of the NFMC. I must also place on record the work done by Commander Farooq Tarapur, Scon type of mine. He's been a sailing legend, and what is important is that he's been actively involved with the naval sailing team in 470 class, and he's given enhanced coaching, given his time, energy, and spent his own money to coach the naval sailing team, and we are hoping for a medal under your guidance, Commander Tarapur. Thank you so much for all that you've done. I'm extremely proud of the work that he does. So moving on to what are we doing, I must tell you that I'm extremely delighted to inform you all that at the beginning of last year, we had a meet of the Veer Naris, and many of them had said that they were in trouble and distress because they did not have a place to stay. And it was then that we took up this great initiative to build a Veer Nari accommodation for our people. And I'm glad to tell you that the project was funded purely out of CSR funds. Many companies and many institutions came forward and contributed money, including, I must place on record, the work done by various naval officers, including Admiral Jacob, by Commodore Aluwalia, Chairman MDL, Commander Admiral Narayan Prasad, and many others, I must say. So the Veer Nari facility, it's a 1 BHK facility which will be inaugurated about 4 days from now. We are having a function for the Veer Naris in Mankhurd. It's a brand new facility with fully furnished accommodation, and it's almost free of cost. That will be given to all the Veer Naris. So we hope that you'll be able to spread the word around, and anybody who needs this accommodation, we are more than willing to walk that extra mile to make sure that they are comfortable for the sacrifices that they've made and their husbands have made for the country. So this is one thing I would want to place on record. I also want to thank Commodore Kundu for having delivered this project in a time-bound manner, and of course our donors who have gone out of the way to give large sums of money, be it the Inox Group, which I must thank Admiral Luthra for. Each one of them have funded upwards of 1 crore thereabouts. So thank you so much, and I also would urge the veteran community, if you've got some extra money, give it to us. We'll put it to good use. Or if you know somebody who has extra money, tell us, we'll find them. As far as the pension management system is concerned, a lot of work is happening, and while the SPURSH has got implemented, I believe there were some teething troubles. Team NAVPEN, the ACOPAC, or people in Naval Headquarters or in the WNC are fully at it. And if you have any issues which cannot be resolved by the SPURSH the helpline at PCDA Prayagraj or at NAVPEN, we are willing to take that forward. And if there is anybody who's got a problem, please put it on the group. They can get in touch with my staff or CSOPNA staff, and we'll make sure that it will get resolved in a time-bound manner. That's my assurance to you. NAVPay, everybody is online, and today, as Adm Luthra also brought out, data connectivity is good, 5G is there, and the Navy is also set into place certain data frameworks by which all the data of the veterans is being aggregated, so there'll be better way to deal with it. I also want to, through this forum, I want to say that there were some cases of wherein the Navy wants to pay some money to the people who were affected by the Dhanpalan case, major Dhanpalan case. Almost 500 to 600 officers have not yet submitted some papers, or they have not got in touch with NAVPay. So if there's anybody that you know of, there's a list which is floating around. If you know anybody who's not seen that list, and you can forward it to him, if they can just get in touch, they'll get some money. Okay, so just take this forward if possible. The records have been digitized, all the veteran records, and it is under the Mission Digital India. A common veterans data framework has been set up. So a lot of things are happening. As for the other 2 points which are there, one was the canteen card. I think each one should be much happier now. They can be renewed and used anywhere in any outlet. Annual renewal is not required anymore. Limits have been increased to almost 20 lakhs for officers. So majority of the issues related to the canteen, in my opinion, are resolved. If there are any issues that you are facing, we have Commodore Agarwal here, a very proactive person. Anything that you need or anything that you need help with, he'll be willing to sort that out. Also, recently I bought some things from INCS Online. It's a pretty nice platform. It takes some time to register initially, but once you're done, I think it's a very good platform. You can buy things online and they get delivered at home. And you can sit in Mumbai and buy and get it delivered in Gurgaon also. So with that framework, as far as the veteran activities are concerned, I must also inform you what all is happening in the Western Naval Command. And the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav activities have been completed by and large, but they will run till 15th of August 23. And numerous activities have been planned. And most significant among them was our deployment to ships in every continent. The WNC had sent ships across to Rio, Muscat, and in Mombasa. The OP-POG and the Sankalp, which are for anti-piracy and other deployments, are continuing. The Navy has adopted a ships-first approach. While it was always there, there's a renewed focus towards ensuring that everything that a ship needs is addressed in priority, and large number of things are happening on that front. Many of you would have served on board large number of ships, but never got anything to do with sea duty allowance. Now this project was started, and I can take some credit for it, when I was a captain, and finally the systems have materialized, and today an officer who goes to sea for, let's say, the anti-piracy patrol gets about 25,000 bucks a month. So that's the additional grant that he gets, and a sailor gets about 17,300. And it's related to a risk and hardship matrix, which has finally been sanctioned after a lot of hiccups. And now, hopefully, financially, going to sea is not a loss-making proposition. It's besides the excitement, it is also a rewarding proposition in terms of financial needs is concerned. Our ships of the Western Naval Command have been deployed extensively. We had deployed to the East Coast for the PFR, the Milan. Thereafter, we had the annual exercise called Exercise Pashchimi Leher. The ORI, a large number of anti-narcotic operations have been conducted, which basically ensured that we could recover a huge amount of narcotics worth thousands of crores. And these are a few opportunities that come and we deploy. The mission-based deployments are in progress, and ships have deployed extensively from Africa to anywhere you can talk. There has also been, we've done the first Indian Ocean Naval Symposium IONS exercise of Goa. INS Tarkash was deployed to the Mediterranean, South Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. So there's much that is happening. But I think the most important one that may interest many of you is that we've joined the Coalition Maritime Force as an associate partner with the Americans in the Gulf. So now we operate from our P-8I aircraft, and our ships get deployed for these taskings in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and that area. As far as the inductions and de-inductions are concerned, while some smaller ships have been de-inducted from Mumbai, WNC, carrier has been commissioned, Vikrant, many of you know. We recently commissioned Marmagao, and Wagir is going to get commissioned on 23rd of this month. The 4 P-8Is have moved to Goa and they've settled there. We have the new ALHs which has come in, which are pretty handy, and we've been able to save a few lives because of the ALH aircraft, wherein we have been able to do some medical evacuation from sea, as well as we had an incident at sea of Goa, and we could save that life. I think that's huge, and credit must go to our medical fraternity as well. The first set of MH-60 Romeo helicopters have arrived at Cochin, and we are preparing to have them here. The basing pattern has been decided. And above all, a large number of ships, 44 ships are under construction at various stages, and hopefully we'll get some more orders in the pipeline in the near future. The Seabird was a dream project for many of you, and it was just beyond the horizon for most. It's now on the phase of final phase. Hopefully the aircraft carrier jetty will get inaugurated while I'm still in service, and we will start. We've already moved 2 submarines there as permanent basing, and we are going to start moving ships to Karwar come February onwards. Almost 11,000 houses are under construction there of various categories, be it the civilians, the officers, and the sailors. So when it got delayed by about 2 years because of COVID, but I think whenever it gets to a full state of readiness, it will be a dream project to visit, and many of you will be very delighted to see what has actually come up in terms of quality of build, in terms of how things have happened. And in Mumbai, large amount of infrastructure is being created, and our effort has been to improve quality of life for everyone, from the officer to the sailor, and numerous initiatives with foundation stones and seeds being laid by many of my predecessors. Some of them are in the state of maturing, some of them are in the state of being delivered, and some of them are at the stage of coming out of the ground for future, are in progress. Overall, my assessment is when these get completed by about 2025, 26, there'll be no shortage of accommodation in Mumbai. Each and every person will be able to walk into a house. In fact, you'll be glad to know that we have stopped sharing accommodation for mass chiefs. Each mass chief gets a house on arrival. Our aim is to stop sharing for the chief petty officers by 15th of January, which is a few days from here, because we're going to get some new blocks. And I hope in the future the Navy will be a better place to live in, and all those people who are leaving because of sharing of accommodation will not have that excuse at least. Of course, the 2 major things also which have happened are, one is that the pipeline for, the independent pipeline for the Navy, for the water pipeline has been laid and inaugurated, and this has resulted in better water supply. So as we decongest Mumbai, we will reach a stage where you should be able to get water on the tap, a dream for many Mumbaikars, especially in Navy Nagar and Nofra. The metro line project has been finally accepted once again by the state government, and the DPR has been sanctioned. So the important part is the DPR has been sanctioned, and the metro line will come up to the Navy Nagar bus stand underground, and so it will make life easier for each one of you who wants to commute for some distance to Navy Nagar for whatever reasons in the future. My gut feeling is that it will take about 2.5 years, because it's got to connect from Cuff Parade to here. And the good part is that it's going to be funded by the state government, and nothing has to be paid by the Indian Navy. The Agniveer scheme is up and running. A total of 2,747 Agniveers have joined Chilka, out of which there are 241 of them are women candidates who have joined. We already have almost 25 women officers on board ships. The feedback is pretty positive. So we are doing everything that we can do to make sure that we are able to adjust to this new normal which happens. A large number of Navy Week activities have happened, and whether it is the Heritage Run, the Songs of Freedom at NCPA, the Navy Half Marathon, the Navy Band Concert, we have realigned many of them from our lessons of the past, and also what we need to do, especially after COVID. We've had the Navy Night at the Kohli Stadium recently. We also had the musical evening at the Kohli Stadium, and the Navy Night at the Command Mess, which was the equivalent of the Navy Ball. And a large number of activities have happened. So we are back to normal, and hopefully this next wave of COVID will not hit us, but we are prepared. I'm glad that many of you did get to participate in these. Finally, I must say that a large amount of work is being done by the veterans as well. So we have the Veterans Day parade tomorrow, and we hope to see you in larger numbers tomorrow, at least, because it shouldn't happen that, the governor is there, the whole Navy is there, and the veterans are not there. So this is one request that I have to the veterans. Please pass the word around. We have the cricket match on 21st Jan. Before that, we have the sailing on 9th. And of course, Veterans Day rally is scheduled on the 14th Jan, which will also include the veterans sailors. Our aim in the command is to involve the veterans as much as possible, and we look forward to any suggestions from you, any inputs that you want to give us. We will be willing to take them forward and run step in step with you as we go along. With that, I would like to thank each one of you for your time, and especially Commander Vadera for the event. It's always great to attend such meetings and interact with our people who set this Navy into the framework that we are in. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Admiral Sir. I now request Commander Vijay Vadera, Nausena Medal, President NFMC, for the vote of thanks.
Before I start the vote of thanks, the patron NFMC wanted to know कि कौन सी चक्की का मैं खाना खाता हूँ. तो सर, जो भी चक्की का खाना मेरी बीवी मुझे प्यार से देती है, मुझे खाना पड़ता है. So I derive my passion because I want to do something for the veterans as long as I can do it. It is in my blood and is a small payback to the community to which I belong. On behalf of all members of our foundation, I would like to thank Vice Admiral Ajendra Bahadur Singh, Param Vishesh Seva Medal, Ate Vishesh Seva Medal, Vishesh Seva Medal, ADC, our Commander-in-Chief and patron NFMC, for taking time out of his very busy schedule to attend today's annual event of the Navy Foundation, which is part of NFMC activities to celebrate Veteran Day on 14th January every year. His presence is a measure of the respect and honor which our CNC accords to an iconic, our second Chief of Naval Staff, late Admiral B.S. Soman. We also gratefully acknowledge the presence of Admiral Vijay Shekhawat, our former naval chief, and Vice Admiral Inder Bedi, who has come all the way from Delhi to attend today's lecture. And of course, all serving officers with their spouses, with their own spouses, for being part of today's prestigious event of the Navy Foundation. Our Marine Committee is indeed grateful to Headquarters Western Naval Command for giving full support to our foundation and being extremely caring in dealing with the problems of veterans and VNREs. Our heartfelt thanks to Flag Officer Maharashtra Area, Commanding Officer Angre and Commanding Officer Kunjali for providing the required logistics support. I would also like to thank CMD MDL Admiral Narayan Prasad for, as always, sponsoring today's event. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank all the veterans and VNREs for coming from far-off places to attend the Soman lecture today and being such an appreciative audience. Your participation and thought-provoking questions and interaction with our guest speaker has provided immense food for thought. I'm sure that we all have benefited from the impressive thought-provoking talk by Admiral Girish Luthra, and therefore may I request all present to please give him a standing ovation. Thank you. Kindly remain standing. We will now play the national anthem. Thank you. You may kindly proceed to IMSC for the lunch being hosted by Flag Officer Commanding in Chief for the veterans. Other invitees, please go outside in the foyer for the group photograph. Thank you and have a good day.